Rose Patterson's weathered hands trembled as she dropped her teacup, porcelain shattering against marble as the impossible sound drifted down from upstairs. Her dead daughter's lullaby, note for perfect note. It wasn't just any song. It was Isabella's secret composition, written during pregnancy and never shared with another living soul. Mrs. Chen gasped from the doorway, clutching her chest as the melody continued, while Alexander Hayes stood frozen at the bottom of his Manhattan mansion's grand staircase, his face draining of all color. The twins, who hadn't slept peacefully in 18 months, were finally quiet, their soft breathing audible between the haunting verses that only Isabella should have known. Rose's mind raced through impossible explanations as she remembered the sealed diary hidden in her bedroom safe, containing the only written copy of those lyrics. "Call security," Alexander whispered, his voice cracking. Someone's been in Isabella's things. But how could a stranger from rural Georgia know the song that died with his wife? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The Hayes mansion stood like a fortress of grief on Manhattan's Upper East Side, its limestone facade hiding the shattered remains of what was once New York's most envied family. Alexander Hayes, at 35, commanded a tech empire worth $500 million, yet couldn't buy his way out of the darkness that had consumed his home since Isabella's death 18 months ago. The car accident had been swift, merciless, a drunk driver running a red light, stealing not just his wife but his children's sense of safety in an instant. Emma and Ethan, his 5-year-old twins, had become ghosts in their own home, where once their laughter echoed through marble hallways, now only silence stretched between them and the world. 18 nannies had tried and failed to reach them. The children would scream, bite, or simply shut down completely whenever a new caregiver appeared. Child psychologists spoke of selective mutism and trauma responses, but their clinical terms couldn't explain the twins' eerie ability to sense whenever someone approached with anything less than genuine love. Rose Patterson, Isabella's 75-year-old mother, had moved in after the funeral to help, but even she struggled to bridge the chasm between Alexander's workaholic numbness and the children's desperate need for connection. Rose carried her own secrets, photographs she kept hidden in her jewelry box, letters she'd never sent, and memories of a daughter she'd given away 50 years ago in a moment of youthful desperation. She'd spent decades trying to forget that choice, but lately the past seemed to be calling her back. Victoria Ashworth, Isabella's younger sister, circled the family like a vulture waiting for weakness. At 48, her inability to have children had curdled into bitter resentment toward those who could. She watched Alexander's struggles with calculating eyes, already consulting lawyers about custody rights and suitable guardians for her precious niece and nephew. Victoria had always lived in Isabella's shadow, and now she saw an opportunity to finally claim what she believed should have been hers. Into this fractured world walked Zara Washington, a 28-year-old woman from rural Georgia whose own tragedy had hollowed her out in different ways. 2 years ago, she'd lost her 5-year-old son, Marcus, to leukemia, watching helplessly as medical bills consumed her savings and hope drained from his eyes. She'd moved north, seeking not just work, but escape from memories that haunted every corner of her small hometown. When the employment agency mentioned the Hayes family's desperate need for help, Zara saw it as divine providence, a chance to channel her maternal instincts toward children who needed her, even if they couldn't be hers. None of them knew that fate had been orchestrating this meeting for decades, weaving together bloodlines and broken hearts in ways that would soon shatter everything they thought they understood about family, love, and the mysterious forces that sometimes guide lost souls toward exactly where they belong. The mahogany door to the master bedroom stood slightly ajar, golden afternoon light spilling through silk curtains as Alexander climbed the stairs with leaden feet. He'd returned early from a board meeting, his mind churning with quarterly projections and merger deadlines, anything to avoid thinking about the anniversary approaching next week. 18 months since Isabella's laugh had filled these halls, since her perfume had lingered on his pillowcases, since he'd felt anything resembling peace. The sound hit him first, a low melodic humming that made his blood freeze mid-step. Not just any tune, but the lullaby Isabella used to sing when she was pregnant, the one she'd composed herself during those magical months when their future seemed limitless. His hand gripped the doorframe as memories crashed over him. Isabella's voice floating from the nursery at midnight, her gentle fingers stroking her swollen belly, the way she'd whisper promises of love to their unborn children. Alexander pushed the door open wider, his breath catching in his throat. There, in the center of his marriage bed, sat Zara Washington, with Emma curled against her left side and Ethan nestled into her right. The children, who hadn't slept peacefully since their mother's death, looked serene for the first time in months. Ethan's thumb had found its way to his mouth, a habit he'd abandoned after the funeral, while Emma's face had relaxed from its perpetual mask of wariness. But it was Zara's voice that shattered him. The melody poured from her lips with heartbreaking familiarity, each note exactly as Isabella had sung it, down to the subtle vibrato on the high notes and the gentle pause before the chorus. How could this stranger, this woman from rural Georgia who'd walked into their lives 3 days ago, know the most intimate song his wife had ever created? "What the hell do you think you're doing in my bed?" The words exploded from him before rational thought could intervene. 18 months of grief and rage found their target in this moment of impossible violation. The twins startled awake, Emma's eyes going wide with the fear he'd worked so hard to erase, while Ethan began the trembling that preceded his anxiety attacks. Zara moved with practiced calm, her hands instinctively shielding the children even as she rose to face his fury. "Mr. Hayes, I can explain—" "Explain?" Alexander's voice cracked with emotion he'd kept buried for months. "Explain how you know that song. Explain what gave you the right to come into my bedroom, into my wife's space." His vision blurred with tears he refused to shed, the careful walls he'd built around his heart crumbling at the sound of Isabella's lullaby on another woman's lips. The slap came without conscious decision. His palm connected with Zara's cheek in a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the mansion's bones. She staggered back, one hand flying to her face, but she didn't cry out, didn't even speak. Her dark eyes, so different from Isabella's blue ones, yet somehow familiar in their depth of understanding, simply looked at him with a mixture of shock and something that might have been pity. "I don't care what excuse you have," Alexander snarled, his hand stinging with the violence he'd never thought himself capable of. "You're fired. Get out of my house. Get out now." Emma began to cry, the broken, silent tears that had become her signature since losing her mother. Ethan's breathing grew shallow and rapid, his small hands clutching at the comforter with white knuckles. But Zara's attention remained fixed on Alexander, her voice steady despite the red handprint blooming across her brown skin. "They begged me not to leave them," she said quietly, her southern accent soft as velvet. Ethan had a nosebleed, and Emma was having nightmares again. "I stayed because they asked me to stay, because they finally felt safe enough to sleep." Her words hit him like physical blows, each one true and damning. He had abandoned his children again, choosing work over their desperate need for comfort. He had hired Zara precisely because the other 18 nannies couldn't handle the twins' trauma responses. And now, when she'd finally achieved what seemed impossible, peaceful sleep for his broken babies, he was destroying it with his own damaged rage. Zara leaned down to kiss the top of each child's head, her movements gentle despite the violence she'd just endured. "Be good for your daddy," she whispered, though both twins were now crying silently, their small bodies shaking with renewed abandonment. She walked past Alexander without another word, her dignity intact, even in dismissal. He heard her footsteps on the marble stairs, heard the front door close with devastating finality. Only then did he sink onto the edge of the bed where his children lay devastated, realizing that in trying to protect Isabella's memory, he might have just destroyed their only chance at healing. The silence that followed felt different than before. Not empty, but poisoned with fresh loss. The shattered teacup lay forgotten on the marble floor as Rose Patterson stood frozen in the mansion's grand foyer, her weathered hands pressed against her chest, where her heart hammered with recognition. That song, Isabella's secret lullaby, still echoed in her mind like a ghost demanding acknowledgement. She had been the only other person to hear it, sitting beside her daughter's hospital bed during those precious final hours when Isabella, delirious with fever, had hummed it one last time. Mrs. Chen appeared at Rose's elbow, her usually composed face etched with concern. "Mrs. Patterson, are you all right? You look like you've seen a spirit." "I might have," Rose whispered, her voice barely audible. She moved toward the stairs with unsteady steps, each one weighted with 5 decades of buried memories. The melody had awakened something she'd tried to forget. A young woman's desperate choice, a baby given away, a hole in her heart that never quite healed. 20 minutes later, Alexander descended the staircase like a man walking to his own execution. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had just discovered new depths to his own capacity for destruction. Rose took one look at the red mark on his knuckles and the shame etched into every line of his face, and she knew what had happened. "You hit her," Rose said, not a question, but a statement heavy with disappointment. "You hit that sweet girl because she gave your children something you haven't been able to give them in 18 months. Peace." Alexander collapsed into one of the antique chairs that Isabella had loved, his head in his hands. She knew the song, Rose. She knew Isabella's lullaby, the one she never sang for anyone else. How is that possible? Rose moved to the mahogany secretary desk where Isabella used to write thank-you notes and invitations, her fingers tracing the familiar wood grain. Hidden behind the ornate mirror was a small lever that opened a secret compartment, one Isabella had discovered as a child and used to hide her most precious treasures. Rose's hands shook as she retrieved a yellowed envelope sealed but never sent. "There are things about our family you don't know," Rose said slowly, settling into the chair across from Alexander. "Things I should have told Isabella before she died. Things I should have told you years ago." Her voice cracked with the weight of long-held secrets. That lullaby wasn't just Isabella's creation. She opened the envelope with trembling fingers, revealing a faded photograph of a young black woman holding a newborn baby. The woman's eyes held the same depth of compassion that Alexander had seen in Zara's face, the same quiet strength that had calmed his children when nothing else could. "This is Rosalind," Rose whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "My daughter, Isabella's half-sister." "Born in 1965 when I was 17 and unmarried, when the world wasn't ready for a white woman to raise a black man's child." The photograph slipped from her fingers like a confession finally set free. Alexander's head snapped up, his grief-fogged mind struggling to process what he was hearing. "What are you saying?" "I gave her away," Rose continued, her voice breaking, "to a loving family in Georgia, who could give her the life I couldn't. But I taught her that lullaby first, hummed it to her every night for 3 months while I carried her, sang it to her in the hospital after she was born. It was the only gift I could leave with her." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, opening up in the foundation of everything Alexander thought he knew about his family. Rose reached for another photograph, this one more recent, a newspaper clipping from a Georgia community newsletter showing a young woman at a children's charity event. "Zara Washington," Rose said, pointing to the familiar face. "Born Rosalind Washington, your children's aunt, my granddaughter." Alexander stared at the photograph until his vision blurred. The woman in the picture had the same gentle smile he'd witnessed upstairs, the same hands that had comforted his children with an inexplicable familiarity. "How do you know this?" "Because I've been looking for her for 50 years, Rose admitted. Hiring private investigators, following leads that went nowhere, hoping someday I'd find the courage to reach out. When the employment agency mentioned her name and where she was from, I knew. I've been watching her with the children, Alexander. She doesn't just know how to care for them, she belongs with them." The sound of children crying drifted down from upstairs, heartbroken sobs that had become the soundtrack of the Hayes household. Alexander looked toward the staircase, then back at Rose, the magnitude of his mistake crushing down on him like a physical weight. "I destroyed it," he said hoarsely. "Whatever healing was happening, whatever connection they had, I destroyed it because I couldn't handle hearing Isabella's song from someone else's lips." Rose stood slowly, her arthritis forgotten in the urgency of the moment. "Then you fix it. You find that girl and you bring her home, because those children upstairs just lost the first person since their mother who made them feel safe. And Alexander?" She paused at the foot of the stairs, her voice carrying 5 decades of regret. "Don't let pride cost you the family Isabella would have wanted for her babies." As Rose climbed toward the sound of her grandchildren's broken hearts, Alexander remained frozen in his chair, staring at the photographs that had rewritten everything he thought he understood about love, family, and the mysterious ways that broken people sometimes find exactly what they need in the most unexpected places. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and he realized that somewhere in Manhattan, his children's salvation was walking away from them with his handprint still burning on her cheek. The lullaby played on in his memory, no longer haunting but healing, if only he could find the courage to let it. The small apartment in Harlem felt like a sanctuary after the opulent coldness of the Hayes mansion. Zara sat on her second-hand couch, pressing a bag of frozen peas against her swollen cheek while staring at the stack of unpaid bills on her coffee table. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been fired from the best-paying job of her life for the crime of making 2 broken children feel safe. Her reflection in the dark window showed the red handprint Alexander had left, a mark that stung less than the memory of Emma and Ethan's terrified faces as she'd walked away. Her phone had been ringing for 2 hours. First Mrs. Chen, then Rose Patterson, and now Alexander himself, whose name flashed on the screen with desperate persistence. Zara let it go to voicemail again, not ready to hear his excuses or apologies. She'd heard them before from other employers who'd let their prejudices override their judgment, though none had ever raised a hand to her. The knock on her door came at midnight, soft but insistent. Through the peephole she saw Alexander Hayes standing in her hallway like a man who'd lost everything and was gambling his last dollar on a prayer. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his eyes held the hollow desperation of a parent watching his children slip away. "Please," he said when she opened the door, "just let me explain." Zara studied his face for a long moment, seeing past the wealth and arrogance to the broken father underneath. "You have 5 minutes," she said, stepping aside to let him into her modest home. Alexander's eyes swept over her small apartment. The worn furniture, the medical bills on the table, the shrine to her son Marcus on the bookshelf with his photograph surrounded by his favorite toys. When his gaze returned to her face, the shame in his expression deepened. "Rose told me about the lullaby," he said quietly. "About her daughter. About you." He pulled out the faded photograph Rose had shown him, the image of a young black woman holding a newborn baby. "Is this your mother?" Zara's breath caught in her throat. She'd been adopted as an infant, raised by loving parents who'd told her she was chosen, special, wanted. But she'd always wondered about the woman who'd given her life, the face that might explain her own features. Taking the photograph with trembling fingers, she saw her own eyes looking back at her from 50 years in the past. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "Rose Patterson is your grandmother," Alexander said, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "Isabella was your half-aunt. The twins are your family, Zara, blood family." The photograph slipped from her fingers as the world tilted on its axis. Every inexplicable moment from the past 3 days suddenly made sense. Why the children had trusted her so quickly, why she'd felt drawn to their pain, why the lullaby had felt like coming home. She sank onto her couch, pressing her hands to her face as 50 years of questions found their answers. "I need you to come back," Alexander continued, kneeling in front of her chair like a man begging for forgiveness. "Not as an employee, as family. Those children upstairs have been crying since you left. They won't eat, won't sleep, won't let anyone near them. They're asking for their Aunt Zara." Tears streamed down her cheeks as she looked at him. "You hit me," she said simply. "In front of children who've already lost their mother. What kind of man does that?" Alexander's face crumpled with shame. "A broken one! A man so consumed by grief and guilt that he lashed out at the first person who made him feel something other than numb." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "This is my resignation letter from the company. I'm done choosing work over my children. I'm done being the father Isabella would be ashamed of." Zara unfolded the letter, reading the formal language that would step Alexander back from the empire he'd built. At the bottom, in his handwriting, were 3 words that changed everything. "For my family." "What are you asking of me?" she said quietly. "Come home," Alexander replied. "Help me raise them, not as their nanny but as their aunt. Teach me how to be the father they deserve. Help me build something Isabella would be proud of." He paused, his voice breaking. "Help me heal them. Help me heal us all." 3 days later, Zara stood in the mansion's kitchen as Rose Patterson bustled around making breakfast, the 2 women moving in synchrony as if they'd been cooking together for decades rather than hours. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits of possibility. Emma and Ethan sat at the kitchen island, their pajamas rumpled from the best night's sleep they'd had in months. Emma was drawing a picture of 4 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, while Ethan carefully arranged his cereal by color. They still bore the shadows of their trauma, but something fundamental had shifted. They looked up when adults entered the room instead of shrinking away. "Aunt Zara," Emma said, the title rolling off her tongue as if she'd been saying it her whole life. "Can we write new rules for the house?" Zara smiled, pulling out a large sheet of construction paper and a box of crayons. "What kind of rules do you think we need?" "No hitting," Ethan said immediately, his 5-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of their family's recent wound. "Always knock before coming into someone's room," Emma added, glancing toward her father, who had just entered the kitchen. Alexander poured himself coffee with hands that still trembled slightly from the magnitude of the changes he was making. "What else?" he asked, sitting beside his children with careful attention. "Hugs must be asked for," Zara suggested, remembering her training in trauma-informed care. "And everyone gets to feel their feelings without being told they're wrong." Rose wiped her eyes with her apron as she watched 3 generations of her family, biological and chosen, creating something new from the ashes of their separate losses. "Family dinner every night," she added. "No phones, no work, just us talking about our days." For the next hour, They crafted a constitution for their rebuilt household. And pancakes on Sundays, bedtime stories from everyone, not just parents, a gratitude jar where they'd write down good things that happened each day. Most importantly, they wrote, "Love is bigger than blood, and second chances are always possible." While the children colored illustrations for their rules, Alexander pulled Zara aside. "I want to do something more," he said. "Something that honors what we've learned about family and healing." "What do you have in mind?" she asked. "A foundation. A place where other children who've lost parents can find the kind of healing our kids are finding. Where families torn apart by tragedy or prejudice can come back together." His eyes held a light she hadn't seen before, the spark of purpose that went beyond profit margins. "I want you to run it." "You understand trauma in ways I never could." Zara looked through the kitchen doorway at Emma and Ethan, their heads bent together over their artwork, their laughter bubbling up like spring water after a long drought. She thought of her son Marcus, whose death had nearly destroyed her, and how helping these children had begun to heal wounds she thought would never close. "The Marcus and Isabella Foundation," she said softly, "where broken families learn to become whole again." Alexander nodded, understanding passing between them like a bridge built from shared pain and hope. They would honor their losses by preventing others from walking the same dark paths alone. That evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table Rose had set with Isabella's favorite china, Victoria Ashworth stood outside the mansion's gates. She'd been watching the house for days, documenting the comings and goings, building her case for why the courts should remove the twins from Alexander's unsuitable household. Through the dining room windows, she could see them. Her niece and nephew laughing with the black woman she'd hired investigators to research, the elderly woman Victoria barely tolerated, and her brother-in-law, who'd never appreciated what he had. They looked happy, she had to admit. But happiness wasn't enough. Those children deserved better than a grieving father and his newest charity case. Tomorrow, she would file the custody petition that would tear this makeshift family apart. Tomorrow, she would fight for what Isabella would have really wanted for her children. And if she had to destroy Alexander's newfound peace to save those children from his poor judgment, then that was a sacrifice she was willing to make. Victoria didn't see the love in the dining room window. She only saw weakness, vulnerability, and opportunity. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a stone-faced courier who seemed to understand the devastation contained within the manila envelope. Alexander's hands shook as he read the custody petition, each typed line a calculated assault on everything they'd built over the past month. Victoria Ashworth was seeking immediate temporary guardianship of Emma and Ethan Hayes, citing an unstable household environment, questionable caregiver arrangements, and the father's documented history of violence against domestic staff. Rose found him in his study an hour later, the papers scattered across his desk like the remnants of a bomb blast. His face had gone ashen, the progress they'd made in healing their family suddenly seeming as fragile as spun glass. "She's going to destroy us," he said, his voice hollow with despair. "She's going to tear apart everything we've fought to build." The petition painted a damning picture of their household. Victoria's private investigators had been thorough, photographing Zara entering and leaving the mansion, documenting her modest background, even interviewing former employers in Georgia who spoke of her as nice enough, but perhaps too attached to other people's children. The document described Alexander as emotionally unstable, prone to violent outbursts, and dependent on unqualified caregivers to perform basic parental duties. Zara read the papers with a calm that belied the storm raging inside her chest. Seeing her life reduced to legal ammunition against the family she'd grown to love felt like losing Marcus all over again. Watching something precious slip away despite her desperate attempts to hold on. "They're making me sound like a threat," she said quietly, "like loving your children is somehow dangerous." The twins, sensing the adult's distress with the intuition that trauma had sharpened in them, became clingy and anxious. Emma refused to let Zara leave her sight, while Ethan regressed to the sleepless nights that had defined the months after Isabella's death. The family rules they'd so carefully crafted seemed powerless against the fear that Victoria's legal assault had brought into their home. Dr. Patricia Williams, the family therapist Alexander had finally agreed to see, reviewed the custody petition with professional concern. A woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and decades of experience with traumatized families, she understood the delicate progress the Hayes household had made. "This is about more than custody," she told Alexander during an emergency session. "This is about power, control, and unresolved grief. Victoria lost her sister and can't bear to see her children thriving without Isabella." The media attention began subtly. A gossip columnist's item about trouble in paradise for the tech mogul widower, followed by more pointed pieces questioning the appropriateness of Alexander's household arrangements. Victoria had connections throughout Manhattan's social circles, and she wielded them like weapons, dropping hints about concerning developments in the Hayes family situation. At the exclusive private school Emma and Ethan attended, other parents began whispering. During pickup time, conversations would stop when Zara approached, then resume in hushed tones about the situation at the Hayes house. Some parents, influenced by Victoria's carefully planted seeds of doubt, wondered aloud whether it was really appropriate for children from such a prominent family to be raised by domestic help. The school's headmistress, Mrs. Margaret Thornton, called Alexander for a meeting that felt more like an interrogation. Her office, filled with portraits of distinguished alumni and academic awards, became a courtroom where Alexander found himself defending his family's choices. "Mr. Hayes," she said carefully, "we've received some concerns from other parents about the stability of your children's home environment." "What kind of concerns?" Alexander asked, though he already knew. "Questions about Miss Washington's qualifications, her background, whether she's truly equipped to provide the kind of guidance children from families like yours require." Mrs. Thornton's words were carefully chosen, dancing around the racial undertones without acknowledging them directly. "Perhaps it would be best if we discussed alternative arrangements for Emma and Ethan's care." Alexander felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but this time it was directed at the right target. "Miss Washington is my children's aunt," he said firmly. "She's family. And if this school has a problem with my family, then perhaps we need to find an institution that understands what truly matters in education." The threat to withdraw his substantial donations and his children's enrollment sent Mrs. Thornton into damage control mode. But the conversation confirmed what Alexander already suspected. Victoria's campaign was working. She was using society's prejudices as weapons, turning their community's assumptions about race and class into ammunition for her custody battle. Meanwhile, Zara threw herself into research, determined to understand every aspect of Victoria's legal strategy. She spent hours in the public library, reading family law texts and custody precedents, preparing for a fight she'd never imagined having to wage. Her adoption records, sealed for decades, became crucial evidence in establishing her true relationship to the children. The process of unsealing them required court orders and legal fees they could barely afford, but Rose insisted on covering the costs with money she'd saved from her late husband's life insurance. The DNA test results arrived on a Friday afternoon, scientific proof of what their hearts had already known. Zara Washington was indeed the granddaughter of Rose Patterson, making her Emma and Ethan's biological great-aunt. But even with genetic evidence supporting their family connection, Victoria's lawyers argued that biology alone wasn't sufficient to justify the irregular household arrangement. The preliminary hearing took place in a sterile courtroom that smelled of old wood and fresh desperation. Judge Helena Martinez, a stern woman in her 50s with a reputation for fairness, listened as Victoria's attorney painted a picture of Alexander as an unstable widower who'd abdicated his parental responsibilities to an unqualified caregiver. They presented photographs of Zara's modest apartment, her employment history, even her son's medical bills as evidence of her financial instability. Victoria herself took the stand with calculated emotion, speaking of her love for her sister's children and her concerns about their welfare. Isabella would want her babies raised with proper guidance, she testified, dabbing at tears that seemed genuine. She'd want them to have stability, security, the kind of upbringing that honors her memory. But when Dr. Williams testified about the children's remarkable progress since Zara's arrival, cracks began to appear in Victoria's case. The therapist presented detailed notes documenting the twins' improved sleep patterns, their increased willingness to engage with others, their gradual healing from the trauma of losing their mother. "These children have found something they desperately needed," she told the court. "Removing them from this environment now would be catastrophically damaging." The most powerful moment came when Emma and Ethan were brought in for the judge's private chambers interview. Though the details were sealed, those present later described the children's clear, unwavering testimony about feeling safe with Aunt Zara and their father. When asked about their preferences, both children were adamant. They wanted to stay with their family, all of their family. As the hearing adjourned for the weekend, Alexander stood outside the courthouse feeling like a man balanced on a tightrope over an abyss. The preliminary ruling would come Monday, and with it the answer to whether their rebuilt family could survive Victoria's assault. Zara took his hand as they walked down the courthouse steps, reporters calling out questions they ignored. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "we fight for them. We fight for what Isabella would have really wanted, children who are loved, not just provided for." That weekend, an unexpected ally emerged. Mrs. Chen, who had remained largely silent about the family's affairs, approached Alexander with a manila folder containing photographs she'd taken over the past month. Images of Zara reading bedtime stories, of the twins laughing during breakfast, of quiet moments of healing that spoke louder than any legal argument. "These children smile now," the elderly housekeeper said simply. "Before Miss Zara, they were like little ghosts. Now they are children again." As Sunday evening fell over Manhattan, the Hayes family gathered in the living room for what might be their last dinner together. The custody decision loomed like a storm cloud over their carefully rebuilt happiness. But in that moment, surrounded by the family they'd chosen and been chosen by, they found strength in love that no legal system could fully understand or easily destroy. The call came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the Hayes mansion after Judge Martinez's preliminary ruling in their favor. Alexander's phone buzzed with the urgent tone he'd programmed for emergencies, jolting him from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. Mrs. Chen's voice, usually so composed, trembled with panic. "Mr. Hayes, you need to come to Ethan's room immediately. Something's very wrong." Alexander found his son convulsing on his bedroom floor, his small body rigid with seizure activity while Emma knelt beside him, her 5-year-old hands desperately trying to hold his head steady. Zara was already there, having heard the commotion from down the hall, her medical training from caring for Marcus kicking in as she turned Ethan on his side and checked his airway. "Call 911, she instructed calmly, her voice cutting through the chaos of Rose's crying and Mrs. Chen's prayers in Mandarin. "Tell them we have a 5-year-old male with generalized tonic-clonic seizures, no previous history, Duration approximately 4 minutes. The ambulance ride to Mount Sinai Hospital passed in a blur of sirens and medical jargon. Ethan had stopped seizing but remained unconscious, his small form looking impossibly fragile against the adult-sized gurney. Alexander held one tiny hand, while Zara held the other, both adults maintaining calm facades for Emma's sake, while their hearts shattered with each labored breath the boy took. Dr. Sarah Kim, the attending pediatric neurologist, emerged from the emergency room 3 hours later with the grim expression of someone bearing devastating news. Her words hit the family like physical blows. Rare genetic neurological disorder, progressive deterioration, seizures that would likely worsen over time. But it was her next statement that stopped Alexander's world entirely. It's called juvenile temporal lobe epilepsy with developmental regression, Dr. Kim explained. It's extremely rare, fewer than 100 documented cases worldwide. Without specialized treatment protocols, the prognosis is— She paused, choosing her words carefully. Quite poor. Zara's face had gone ashen, her hand gripping the plastic chair so tightly her knuckles went white. Doctor, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, what are the treatment options? Dr. Kim pulled up Ethan's scans on her tablet, pointing to areas of abnormal brain activity. There's an experimental protocol being tested at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. It involves a combination of targeted medications and intensive neurological rehabilitation. But even with treatment, we're looking at significant developmental challenges, possible cognitive impairment, and a lifetime of medical management. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Alexander felt the familiar, crushing weight of helplessness that had consumed him after Isabella's accident, the realization that all his wealth and power meant nothing against the cruel randomness of fate. Emma crawled into his lap, sensing the adult's distress, even if she couldn't understand the medical terminology. There's something else, Zara said suddenly, her voice strange and distant. Doctor, you said fewer than 100 documented cases. Do you have access to the research database? Dr. Kim nodded, pulling up her computer terminal. What are you looking for? Search for Marcus Washington, age 5, diagnosed 3 years ago in Savannah, Georgia. Zara's hands shook as she spelled out her son's full name. I need to know if he had the same condition. The database search results appeared on the screen, and the family watched in stunned silence as Marcus Washington's medical records populated the display. The diagnosis was identical, down to the specific genetic markers and seizure patterns. But what made Alexander's blood run cold was the treatment protocol notation. Experimental therapy discontinued due to financial constraints. Patient deceased. Zara covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face as the full horror of the situation became clear. I lost my son to the same disease that's attacking yours, she whispered. I watched him deteriorate for 8 months because I couldn't afford the treatment that might have saved him. The irony was devastating and complete. The woman who had come into their lives to heal their family's trauma was now watching helplessly as the same disease that had destroyed her world threatened to claim another child she loved. Alexander felt the universe's cosmic cruelty with stunning clarity, bringing Zara into their lives just in time to experience the same loss all over again. Doctor. Kim, sensing the family's distress, spoke gently. The experimental protocol has advanced significantly since Marcus's case. We have better medications now, more targeted interventions. If we start treatment immediately, Ethan's prognosis could be very different. Whatever it costs, Alexander said immediately. Money is no object. We'll fly him to Philadelphia tonight if necessary. But Zara was staring at the medical records with an expression Alexander had never seen before. Not despair, but something approaching fierce determination. No, she said firmly. We bring the treatment here. We bring the entire team to New York, and we don't just save Ethan. We save every child with this condition. Alexander looked at her as if she'd lost her mind. Zara, that's not how medical research works. You can't just relocate an entire clinical trial. You can if you're willing to fund it properly, she interrupted, her grief transforming into purpose before their eyes. The Marcus and Isabella Foundation that we talked about, this is what it's for. We establish a pediatric neurology center right here in Manhattan. We bring in the best doctors in the world, and we make sure no family ever has to choose between their child's life and their financial survival. Rose, who had been silent through the medical consultation, suddenly spoke up. Isabella left a trust fund, she said quietly. $50 million set aside for the children's future. What if their future is helping other children? The pieces began falling into place with stunning clarity. Alexander's business connections could navigate the regulatory requirements for establishing a medical research facility. Zara's intimate knowledge of the disease process could guide treatment protocols. Rose's inheritance could fund the initial setup, while Alexander's wealth sustained long-term operations. But even as hope flickered to life, reality crashed back down. Victoria's custody petition was still pending, and Ethan's diagnosis would only strengthen her case that Alexander couldn't provide appropriate care for medically complex children. A man who couldn't protect his son from a genetic disease certainly couldn't be trusted to make decisions about experimental treatments. Dr. Kim interrupted their planning with devastating practicality. I need to be clear about the timeline here, she said. Ethan's condition will likely deteriorate rapidly without intervention. We're talking about weeks, not months, before we see significant cognitive decline. Alexander felt the walls closing in around him. To save his son, he needed to make decisions about experimental treatments that Victoria's lawyers would certainly characterize as reckless endangerment. To protect his custody rights, he needed to appear stable and conservative, following traditional medical advice that might not be enough to save Ethan's life. There's more, Doctor, Kim continued. The experimental protocol requires a primary caregiver with medical training to monitor the patient's condition continuously. It's too intensive for standard nursing care. Zara met Alexander's eyes across the hospital room, understanding passing between them without words. She had the medical background from caring for Marcus, the emotional investment in Ethan's survival, and the determination born from losing one child to refuse to lose another. I'll do it, she said simply. I'll be his primary caregiver through the treatment. Alexander nodded, the decision crystallizing with perfect clarity despite its enormous risks. They would fight for Ethan's life and fight Victoria's custody challenge simultaneously, trusting that love and determination could overcome both legal obstacles and medical impossibilities. As dawn broke over Manhattan, painting the hospital windows with golden light, the Hayes family began planning the most important battle of their lives. Not just for custody of two children, but for the life of one whose survival would determine whether their rebuilt family could withstand the ultimate test of faith, hope, and the healing power of love that transcends blood, race, and the cruel randomness of fate. The DNA results arrived on the same morning as Ethan's third seizure, delivered by courier to a household already reeling from medical crisis. Rose Patterson's hands trembled as she opened the envelope, knowing that the scientific proof inside would either validate everything they'd believed about their family connection or destroy the foundation of trust they'd built over the past 2 months. The laboratory letterhead was official, clinical, cold in its precision, but the words that followed rewrote 50 years of family history with stunning clarity. Probability of biological relationship between Rose Patterson and Zara Washington, 99.97%. Confirmed, grandmother-granddaughter relationship. Below that, in smaller text, additional findings that made Rose's heart skip. Shared genetic markers indicate hereditary predisposition to juvenile temporal lobe epilepsy carried through maternal bloodline. Alexander found Rose in the kitchen at dawn, The DNA report spread before her like evidence of a crime she'd committed half a century ago. Her weathered face was streaked with tears as she stared at the scientific confirmation of what her heart had known from the moment Zara first hummed Isabella's lullaby. "It's all my fault," Rose whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of generational guilt. "The disease, Ethan's seizures, Marcus's death, it all traces back to me. I passed this cursed gene to my daughter, who never knew she carried it, and now it's killing my great-grandson." The genetic counselor, Dr. Maria Santos, arrived that afternoon to explain the hereditary implications with gentle professionalism. She spread out family trees and genetic charts across the dining room table, mapping the invisible threads that had connected 3 generations of tragedy. "The gene mutation is recessive," she explained. "It requires 2 copies to manifest, which is why it's so rare. Isabella was a carrier but never showed symptoms. However, if the father also carries the gene..." Alexander's blood ran cold. "Are you saying this is my fault too?" Dr. Santos pulled up his genetic test results on her tablet. "Mr. Hayes, you also carry the recessive gene. The probability of both parents being carriers is less than 1 in 10,000. For both children to inherit the active disease is essentially astronomical odds. The revelation that both twins carried the gene hit the family like a second catastrophe." Emma showed no symptoms yet, but the medical team explained that the disease could manifest anywhere between ages 4 and 12. They were living with a genetic time bomb, watching both children for signs of the progressive neurological deterioration that had already begun claiming Ethan's developing mind. Zara absorbed this information with the stoic determination of someone who had already lost everything once and refused to experience that helplessness again. "So we fight it," she said simply. "We fight it in both children, and we fight it in every child who comes after them." The experimental treatment protocol arrived from Philadelphia 3 days later, accompanied by Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the neurologist who had developed the therapy after losing her own nephew to the same condition. A brilliant woman in her 40s with intense dark eyes and steady hands, she had devoted her career to conquering the disease that had devastated her family. "The treatment is aggressive," Dr. Rodriguez explained as she reviewed Ethan's latest brain scans. "We're essentially rewiring his neural pathways while the seizures are actively damaging them. It's like performing surgery on a building while it's collapsing." She paused, meeting each family member's eyes. "The success rate is 63% for cognitive preservation, 42% for complete seizure control. Without treatment, survival past age 10 is less than 15%. The medical equipment that transformed the mansion's east wing into a specialized treatment facility arrived in unmarked trucks, installed by technicians who worked through the night. EEG monitors, medication pumps, emergency resuscitation equipment, the sterile machinery of modern medicine incongruous against the mansion's antique furnishings and oil paintings. Victoria's custody petition gained momentum as news of Ethan's diagnosis leaked to the media. Her lawyers argued that Alexander was subjecting his children to dangerous experimental treatments, that a responsible guardian would seek traditional medical care at established institutions. The tabloids picked up the story with sensational headlines: "Tech mogul's desperate gamble," and "Medical experiments on grieving children." The custody hearing resumed in Judge Martinez's courtroom 3 weeks after Ethan's first seizure, his condition now a central element in Victoria's case against Alexander's fitness as a parent. Victoria took the stand with carefully orchestrated emotion, describing her nephew's deterioration as evidence of her brother-in-law's poor judgment. "Your Honor," Victoria testified, her voice breaking with practiced grief, "Ethan needs stable, traditional medical care, not experimental procedures administered by domestic staff. Isabella would never have wanted her children used as test subjects for unproven treatments." But Victoria's carefully constructed case began unraveling when Dr. Rodriguez took the stand as an expert witness. The neurologist's testimony about the treatment protocol's scientific foundation and early results painted a very different picture of the medical decisions being made. More damaging to Victoria's position was the revelation that she had never visited Ethan during his hospitalization, never inquired about his treatment options, never demonstrated the concerned involvement she claimed to feel. The turning point came when Zara was called to testify about her medical background and relationship to the children. Under oath, she described watching her son Marcus die from the same disease now threatening Ethan, the helplessness of knowing a treatment existed but being unable to afford it, the months of grief that had nearly destroyed her faith in everything good. "I failed to save my own child," Zara told the packed courtroom, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "But I will not fail to save Ethan and Emma. This isn't about money or medical experiments. It's about a grandmother keeping a promise to her granddaughter, an aunt protecting her nephew, a family refusing to let genetics determine their children's fate." The revelation of the blood relationship between Zara and the children sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Victoria's face went ashen as the genetic test results were entered into evidence, proving that the woman she'd characterized as an unqualified outsider was actually the children's closest living biological relative, after Alexander and Rose. Judge Martinez called a recess, and during the break, something unprecedented happened. Victoria approached Zara in the courthouse hallway, her composed facade cracking to reveal the broken woman underneath. "I can't have children," she said quietly, her voice raw with decades of suppressed pain. "When Isabella died, I thought maybe I could finally be a mother to someone." Zara studied Victoria's face, seeing past the legal manipulation to the grief and longing that had driven her desperate actions. "Those children don't need another mother," she said gently. "They need an aunt who loves them enough to let them heal." The final surprise came from an unexpected source. Emma Hayes, barely 5 years old but wise beyond her years from living through trauma, asked to speak to the judge privately. What she said in those chambers remained sealed, but when Judge Martinez returned to the bench, her decision was swift and unequivocal. "This court finds that the children's best interests are served by remaining in their current family structure," she ruled. "The biological relationship between Miss Washington and the Hayes children, combined with the clear medical necessity of the current treatment protocol, supports maintaining the existing custody arrangement." But the judge wasn't finished. However, this court also recognizes that families can be broader than traditional definitions allow. "Ms. Ashworth, your love for your nephew and niece is evident, even if your methods were misguided. This family has room for an aunt who wants to help, rather than an adversary who wants to control." Victoria broke down completely, 50 years of grief and longing pouring out in the sterile courtroom. Rose was the first to reach her, followed by Alexander, and finally Zara, all of them surrounding the broken woman who had tried to tear their family apart because she couldn't bear to be left out of it. As they left the courthouse together, all of them, even Victoria, the reporters shouting questions couldn't capture the true story unfolding. This wasn't just about custody or medical treatments or legal victories. It was about the messy, complicated, beautiful process of broken people choosing to become a family, bound not by blood or law but by the simple decision to love each other through the worst circumstances life could devise. Ethan's treatment would continue, Emma's future remained uncertain, and Victoria's path to redemption had just begun. But for the first time since Isabella's death, they would face these challenges together, as a family large enough to hold everyone's pain and strong enough to transform it into hope. 2 years later, The Marcus and Isabella Foundation's Pediatric Neurology Center occupied a gleaming 8-story building on Manhattan's Upper East Side, its windows overlooking Central Park, where children who might not have survived without the center's interventions now played with their families. The bronze plaque beside the main entrance bore the names of 2 children, one who had been lost to the disease and one whose battle had led to breakthrough treatments that were changing the lives of families around the world. Ethan Hayes, now 7 years old, sat in the center's playroom surrounded by neurological monitoring equipment that had become as familiar to him as his favorite toys. His seizures had been controlled for 14 months, and while his speech remained slightly delayed, his bright smile and infectious laughter filled the treatment rooms with hope. He was teaching a newer patient, 6-year-old Maria Gonzalez, how to make friendship bracelets while their respective IV medications dripped steadily into their small arms. "The blue one is for brave," Ethan explained seriously, holding up the braided threads. "My Aunt Zara taught me that. She says everyone needs a blue thread because everyone has to be brave sometimes." Emma, now 7 and showing no symptoms of the genetic condition her brother battled daily, had become the center's unofficial ambassador. She drew pictures for newly diagnosed children, explaining in her matter-of-fact way that having a sick brother isn't scary once you understand how to help. Her latest drawing hung in the lobby, a rainbow stretching over a hospital with stick figures holding hands beneath it, and the words, "Love is the best medicine," written in her careful cursive. Alexander stood in his office on the center's top floor, watching through the floor-to-ceiling windows as Zara conducted a family support group in the garden below. 23 families gathered in a circle, sharing their fears and victories while their children played nearby under the supervision of specially trained volunteers. The sight never failed to move him. Communities of healing that had grown from their families' darkest moments. The foundation had treated over 300 children in its 2 years of operation, with a success rate that had attracted medical professionals from around the globe. The experimental protocol Dr. Rodriguez had pioneered was now being replicated in centers across North America and Europe. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one child had evolved into a medical revolution that was rewriting the prognosis for thousands of families. Rose Patterson, now 77 but more energetic than she'd been in years, served as the center's director of family services. Her office walls were covered with photographs of graduating patients, children who had completed their treatment protocols and returned to normal childhood activities. She'd found her life's purpose in her final decades, channeling 50 years of suppressed maternal guilt into fierce advocacy for vulnerable families. "Every child who walks out of here healthy," she often told visitors, "carries a piece of my granddaughter's spirit and my great-grandson's courage." Victoria Ashworth had surprised everyone, including herself, by becoming one of the Foundation's most effective fundraisers. Her connections in Manhattan's social circles, once weaponized for custody battles, now served to secure donations and political support for expanding the center's services. She'd never married, never had biological children, but she'd found her maternal calling in fighting for medical funding and policy changes that protected families facing genetic disorders. "I spent so many years angry about what I couldn't have," she told a gathering of potential donors, "that I almost destroyed what was right in front of me. These children taught me that family isn't about biology or legal documents. It's about showing up when people need you most." The Foundation's success had attracted national attention, leading to congressional hearings on genetic discrimination and healthcare access. Zara found herself testifying before Senate subcommittees, her soft Georgia accent carrying Marcus's story and Ethan's hope to lawmakers who had the power to change policy for millions of families. "We cannot accept a system where a child's survival depends on their parents' bank account," she told the packed hearing room. "Healthcare is not a privilege to be purchased, it's a human right to be protected." The media coverage had been overwhelmingly positive, transforming the Hayes family from tabloid curiosities into symbols of American resilience and innovation. But the attention that mattered most came from other families. Parents who traveled across the country seeking treatment, researchers who collaborated on new protocols, children who found hope in Ethan's story. Dr. Rodriguez had relocated permanently to New York, establishing the center as the world's premier facility for pediatric neurological research. Her team had identified genetic markers that allowed for earlier diagnosis, developed less invasive treatment protocols, and most importantly, discovered preventive therapies that could halt the disease's progression before symptoms appeared. What we've learned from treating these children has applications far beyond this one condition, she explained to a gathering of international medical professionals. We're essentially mapping how to repair damaged neural pathways in real time, which has implications for stroke recovery, traumatic brain injury, even early-stage dementia. The wedding took place in the mansion's garden on a perfect October afternoon, 2 years to the day after Ethan's first seizure. Alexander and Zara exchanged vows beneath an archway of white roses and golden marigolds, surrounded by a congregation that defied every traditional category. Medical professionals sat beside former patients. Manhattan socialites mingled with families from Georgia, and children of every background played together on the lawn where tragedy had once threatened to destroy everything. Ethan served as ring-bearer, walking slowly but steadily down the aisle with his sister Emma as his guide. His movements were careful, deliberate, but his smile outshone the afternoon sun as he delivered the rings that would officially unite the family that had already been forged in crisis and strengthened by hope. Rose gave the blessing, her voice carrying across the garden with the authority of someone who had witnessed both devastating loss and miraculous healing. We gather today not just to celebrate a marriage, but to honor the truth that love is stronger than genetics, more powerful than law, and more enduring than any obstacle life can place in our path. Victoria, standing beside Mrs. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez in the front row, wiped away tears as she watched her former adversaries promise to love and protect each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. She thought of Isabella, the sister she'd envied and lost, and felt certain that wherever Isabella was, she was proud of the family that had grown from the ashes of their shared grief. The reception continued into the evening, with speeches that made everyone cry and laughter that echoed off the mansion's walls. But the most meaningful moment came near midnight when the family gathered in Ethan's room for his bedtime routine, a tradition that had remained constant through seizures, surgeries, and legal battles. As Zara tucked him into bed and began humming Isabella's lullaby, Ethan looked up at the assembled faces surrounding his bed, his father and new stepmother, his great-grandmother Rose, his Aunt Victoria, his sister Emma, even Mrs. Chen and Dr. Rodriguez, who had become extended family through shared purpose. "Are you happy?" Emma asked her brother, the question carrying weight beyond her 7 years. Ethan considered this seriously, his young mind processing concepts of illness and healing, loss and love, family and forever. "I'm brave," he said finally. And brave people can be happy even when things are hard. Alexander squeezed Zara's hand as they turned off the lights and closed the door on another day that had seemed impossible 2 years ago. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, unaware that in one mansion on the Upper East Side, a family had proven that the most powerful force in the universe wasn't money or medicine or legal authority. It was the simple decision to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and healing over hate. The Marcus and Isabella Foundation would continue growing, touching thousands more lives, but its greatest success would always be the quiet miracle that happened every night when a little boy went to sleep surrounded by people who had fought heaven and earth to keep him alive, and who would continue fighting for as long as breath remained in their bodies. Love had won. Family had endured. And somewhere in the vast mystery of existence, Marcus Washington and Isabella Hayes smiled down on the legacy their brief lives had created. Sometimes the greatest miracles come disguised as the most devastating challenges. When Alexander Hayes lost his wife Isabella, he thought his world had ended. When 5-year-old Ethan began having seizures from a rare genetic condition that had already claimed another child's life, it seemed like fate was determined to destroy their family completely. But sometimes God sends angels in the most unexpected packages, and sometimes those angels carry the very wisdom we need to heal wounds we didn't even know existed. Zara Washington came into their lives not as a savior, but as someone who understood loss so profound it could either break you or transform you into something stronger. Through her love for children who weren't biologically hers, through Rose Patterson's courage to face 50-year-old secrets, through Victoria's journey from bitter adversary to protective aunt, we see that family isn't about blood. It's about showing up when life gets impossible and choosing love over fear, hope over despair. The Marcus and Isabella Foundation now saves hundreds of children who might have been lost, proving that our deepest pain can become our greatest purpose. Every ending can be a beginning if we're brave enough to believe in second chances. What family member or friend showed up for you during your darkest hour? Have you ever discovered that what seemed like your greatest loss actually led to unexpected blessings? Share your story below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.